Hi, everyone. I am Kyla Hannington, the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager for the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. On behalf of our office and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, I am delighted to welcome you to the book launch of Steve Fiffer's inspiring, motivating new book, The Moment, Changemakers on Why and How They Joined the Fight for Social Justice. They are as diverse as America, young and old, of color and white, urban and rural, immigrants and native born. They are students and teachers, athletes and artists, lawyers, doctors, politicians, farmers, architects, novelists, and more. Names familiar and unfamiliar. Superheroes, figuratively, and in one case, real. They have founded major corporations and grassroots organizations or struck out on their own. But as diverse a lot as they may be, the people who tell their stories on these pages share one thing in common. Each is committed to fighting inequality and injustice. Each, too, can pinpoint a moment when they were moved to action, when it became impossible to sit on the sidelines and just watch, when the teacher uttered racial slurs, when no one in the college club looked like they did, when the city was on the brink of disaster, when the authorities came for the undocumented mother, when they discovered their ancestors enslaved people, when the cops stopped them in their own driveway, when there was no fresh food in their community, and when the right to vote was threatened. In The Moment, New York Times bestselling author Steve Fiffer presents an oral history from today's social justice activists, many of them still under 30 years old, that is a pitch perfect for these dissonant times. First-person accounts that will inspire us to act, offer a blueprint for making change, and perhaps most importantly, give us hope for the give us hope for the future. Steve Fiffer is the author of the memoir, 3/4, 2 dimes, and a nickel. Most recently, he collaborated with the late civil rights icon, Dr. C.T. Vivian, on his memoir, It's in the Action, Memories of a Nonviolent Warrior. And our office and Prince George's County Memorial Library System welcomed Mr. Fiffer to talk about that book just over a year ago. And during the course of this program, I'll put a link to that in the chat for you to watch. He's also collaborated with the Southern Poverty Law Center co-founder Morris Deese on 2 award-winning memoirs, A Season for Justice and Hate on Trial. He is the co-author of Jimmy Lee and James, 2 Lives, 2 Deaths, and the Movement That Changed America, a Harlem Book Fair nonfiction finalist, and with his wife Sharon, wrote 50 Ways to Help Your Community, a handbook for change. Fiffer, a graduate of Yale College and the University of Chicago Law School, is the winner of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Other books include Tyrannosaurus Sue and How to Watch Baseball. He currently serves on the advisory board of the Chicago-based Civic Leadership Foundation, and he lives in Evansville, Illinois. Joining Mr. Fiffer with us in conversation is one of the featured change makers, Ashley M. Jones, Poet Laureate of the state of Alabama. We've been very fortunate to also feature Ashley in a program previously, and I will also put that in the chat for you so you can catch it later. Ashley M. Jones is a Poet Laureate of the state of Alabama, 2022 to 2026. She received an MFA in poetry from Florida International University, where she was a John S. and James L. Knight Foundation Fellow. She served as official poet for the city of Sunrise, Florida's Little Free Libraries initiative from 2013 to 2015, and her work was recognized in the 2014 Poets and Writers Maureen Egan Writers Exchange Contest and the 2015 Academy of American Poets Contest at FIU. She was also a finalist in the 2015 Hub City Press New Southern Voices Contest, the Crab Orchard Series and Poetry First Book Award Contest, and the National Poetry Series. Her poems and essays appear or are forthcoming in many journals and anthologies, including CNN, the Academy of American Poets, Poetry, Tupelo Quarterly, Prelude, Steel Toe Review, Fjords Review, Quiet Lunch, Poets Respond to Race Anthology, Night Owl, the Harvard Journal of African American Public Policy, Pluck, Valley Voices, New York School Edition, and I apologize because I lost that, Black American Edition PMS poem memoir story, where her work was nominated for a Pushcart Prize in 2016, Kinfolks Quarterly, Tough Times in America Anthology, and Lucid Moose Press's Like a Girl, Perspectives on Femininity Anthology. She received a 2015 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and a 2015 B Metro Magazine Fusion Award. She was an editor of Pank Magazine And her debut poetry collection, Magic City Gospel, was published by Hub City Press in January 2017, and it won a silver medal in poetry at the 2017 Independent Publisher Book Awards. Her second book, Dark Thing, won the 2018 Lena Miles Weaver Todd Prize for Poetry from Pleiades Press, and her third collection, Reparations Now, was published in fall 2021 from Hub City Press. She won the 2018 Lucille Clifton Poetry Prize from Backbone Press, and she is the 2019 winner of the Lucille Clifton Legacy Award from St. Mary's College of Maryland. Jones is a recipient of a poetry fellowship from the Alabama State Council on the Arts and a 2020 Alabama Author Award from the Alabama Library Association. So it is awesome to have you both here. And with me as well is the Executive Director of the Office of Human Rights, Renee Battlebrooks. So to all three of you, welcome.
Thank you, Kyla, for that from the Office of Human Rights, as she said. And thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Steve. It's an honor to spend this next few minutes with you. So thank you for taking the time. Steve, this book is amazing. If you could introduce it so that those that are listening can have an understanding of the foundation of what the book is, etc.
Sure. If you don't mind, I'd like to start with two quotes which form the epigram at the beginning of the book. The first is from Anne Frank. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. And the second is from Dolores Huerta, who's in her 90s, formed the National Farm Workers Association with Cesar Chavez. And she wrote, every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And over the last year, I've been very fortunate to talk to a lot of people who are actively trying to change the world, and Ashley is among them. I knew I had to have Ashley in the book. I was looking for poets, and I found her reading a poem called Manifest Destiny, which I just loved, and thought, got to have her in the book. And she was gracious enough to join the book. I was here a year ago with you all talking about the collaboration with Dr. Vivian. And as you noted, it's titled, It's in the Action. And that was his mantra. And it was that inspiration that led me to want to do this book, to talk to people who have gotten off the sidelines and actually acted to effect change. And so I set about trying to find people from all different walks of life, backgrounds, and so forth. And so there are 35 relatively brief, in their own words, chapters in this book from people like Ashley and from architects, lawyers, doctors. They're not all, very few of them are professional community organizers who devote their entire lives to that. I wanted really, people who are working to make change, and they've incorporated that into their lives, like Ashley has. And I also felt it was very important for it to be their own words, not my words, defining them. And so that's why each chapter is, if some of the people who are listening and watching tonight know about Studs Terkel, I'm not comparing myself at all to the great Studs Terkel, but it's that style of letting the people speak for themselves about the particular and my way into the discussions with them was by asking them about what was the moment. When did you know you had to kind of get off the sidelines and get into the fight for social justice? And I just one more thing, because normally when with my books, when I'm doing an event, I do a reading, and it's my words because I've written the book. Here, I've kind of stayed out of the way of the wonderful words of the people whom I've interviewed, but there was one real takeaway, Renee, from almost all of the interviews, and that was the importance of storytelling. And that's really what I do. And I know that Ashley spoke eloquently about that. I'm going to, before maybe you ask her about the importance of storytelling, I just want to read briefly what one of the other change makers in the book told me about storytelling. And that's, his name's Michael Strautmanis. Grew up in Chicago, kind of had a rough childhood, ended up going to law school. And it was when he was in law school, he kind of realized that he could make a difference in the world. He ended up going to work in the Obama administration, first as a counselor to President Obama, and then as chief of staff to Valerie Jarrett. And now he's an executive vice president with the Obama Foundation. He was a theater major at the University of Illinois. And he said that's where he really learned the importance of storytelling and listening. So here's what he said. I think I'm most fully myself when I'm all in listening to somebody else's story. One of the greatest gifts you can give to another human being is to listen to their story. It's incredibly empowering if through someone's story, you can give them a path to make the change that they want to see. You can give people the path to being a part of something else, something bigger than themselves. That remains the most powerful thing in the world. If you want to move policy, and that's what he is, a policymaker, you got to find a way to get people who have literally no idea what you're talking about to care. You do that through storytelling, because a powerful storytelling will resonate with you, and you'll be able to see yourself in it because of your own experiences. I can say, as an activist, as a change maker, if you can't tell that story, you shouldn't move forward with the issue. Just keep working on it. Keep talking to people. Keep listening. Keep learning. Keep figuring it out until there is a story that moves somebody who is not involved in the day-to-day and not personally impacted in a visceral way by the issue that you care about. Find the story.
Yeah, that is so powerful. And Ashley, why don't you speak to us? Because I'm sure you agree that there is power in the story, and share with us what that means and how it plays out or manifests itself.
Yeah, so I'm a poet. So the story is all that I do. I'm always finding the story. And I think the important thing about the story, especially for me, as I said, as a poet, is that it helps us access the human condition. It helps us to access empathy, which is a vital ingredient for any change that anyone needs or wants to make. And so for me, finding the story is the way that I access the poem, and the poem is the way that I do activism most of the time. And I find that when I read my poems, especially if they have a story that is difficult for people to swallow or something that they wouldn't ordinarily want to talk about, just to that previous quote's point, getting someone who maybe doesn't understand or doesn't agree to understand and feel something, that requires that human connection. And also on the other side, being able to tell your story is a part of change. There are so many of us who have been silenced for so long, and that silence, of course, is violence against us. And because we haven't been able to say, I am here, I am human, so many horrible things have happened throughout centuries. So now, thankfully, there are so many platforms for so many of us to declare who we are. And my activism as a poet, even as I'm the poet laureate, yes, but I'm the first person of color in Alabama's history to be that. And that is also a story that I'm telling. I just want to create spaces for everyone to access their own story. And I do think that's what art making can do. It gives us time and space to really consider who we are and how we got there and who we want to be. But I also want to create just space for people to hear other people's stories as well, and to find that empathy that we're sorely missing in our world. So yeah, that's what the story means to me.
With what you have said and what Steve has said, and I'll pose this question to both, flipping it now on its end, what impact or what change, and I guess I'll ask Steve first so that you can rest for a second, in doing this book, talking with and listening to, what impact did it have on your life? How have you seen change? What was this journey for you?
Sure. I guess I can say two different things about that. The first is that I realized or appreciated more from talking to a wide group of people in a variety of professions, how you find within your own talents or profession the means to try and affect change. And I mean, Ashley's story about that is great, because how does, and maybe we can go right to you, Ashley, and this is like, how, as a poet, do you, people can read your work, certainly. You also teach, and you can influence people that way, but you found another way to kind of almost monetize your work so that it could effect change within the community. So maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. So in the interview, I mentioned my nonprofit, the Magic City Poetry Festival. We, well, first of all, I'll say some more about us. We are a nonprofit here in Birmingham, Alabama, and we do annual programming in April for National Poetry Month. And we work closely with the PEN America chapter that I help to run here as well, just to do events that allow people to have that space and time to talk to each other, to encounter art, to have important discussions. One of the events that we do every year is called 100,000 Poets for Change, which is a worldwide event that's done everywhere. I'm sure there's one in your states, where y'all are. But in ours in Birmingham, we always add a fundraising component. So the general idea of the event is that you have poets coming together around the idea of change and change making. So typically there's readings that happen. Sometimes there's like marathon readings of like so many poets, not 100,000, but a lot, of poets. And in our city, like I said, we add a fundraising component for a change-making agency of some kind who's doing work locally. So one year we chose an organization called Shut Down Etowah, and they were working to help those people who had been detained in the Etowah County Detention Center, which was one of the worst immigrant detention centers in the nation. And I'm saying was because it has since been shut down. They managed to do the thing they set out to do, which is awesome. But at the time, we were still working with them to help provide services to the people who are detained, and again, just try to bring awareness to the issues of inhumane facilities and all the other issues surrounding that detention center. So for our events, we had poets to read poems about different issues. They weren't all about immigration or anything like that. They were just about any issue that the poet felt passionately about. And we also invited some people from the organization to read letters from those who were inside to tell about their experience. So just through that action of reading poems and sharing stories, we were able to raise quite a lot of money. We learned about halfway through our 2 days of doing events that if we raised $1,000, they would match that amount. The organization would match that amount, and it would actually free someone from detention so they could reunite with their families and not be held in those terrible conditions. We ended up raising $1,500, and somebody was freed. Of course, I don't know who it was because there are laws. I can't, know that. But we literally saw the way that telling stories, using art, using just the human condition itself, that does move people, sometimes in ways that a political speech cannot. Even as a teacher, I see this all the time. My students are learning how to have empathy for each other through exploring their art form and reading poems by people who have different perspectives than they do. And I've always said, if everybody in the world would just read a poem, write a poem as often as possible, I really think the world would be a much better place. So that's my soapbox, for the night. Everybody be a poet, please.
Even if we have no talent in the poetry vein.
That's all right. That's all right.
And to give you the second part, Renee, my personal journey was that this brought me into the worlds of so many people from so many different backgrounds that I hadn't experienced before. Again, using Ashley, I think Ashley was one of several African-American people with whom I spoke for the book who told me about how in their households it had been so important for them to have Black dolls, Black Santa Clauses, and so forth. So, this is somewhat eye-opening to me. I'm a huge Chicago Blackhawks fan, the hockey team here. And I've kind of always, I've always said to myself, well, I know there's a big movement to get rid of the logos of teams that have Native American representations on their jerseys or sweaters. But the Blackhawks one has always been a little different. It's dignified, and there hasn't been a big outcry, it seems, to get rid of it. Well, when I spoke to Anthony Tamas Poschel, a young 23-year-old Native American activist here, and he really explained to me the impact that those kind of logos have, particularly on young people, the psychological impact on young people. It totally changed my mind. So I would say that, my personal journey on this was really just entering worlds that I hadn't really entered before, or confronting issues that I hadn't confronted before, and feeling very good about being able to bring those stories to general readership.
Yeah, I actually echo that in reading it. It really did bring me into other people's worlds. And yeah, the storytelling is powerful.
Yeah.
Speaking of that and poetry, Ashley, I love the poetry that's in this book. Would you mind setting that up with the whole George Wallace and reading it? Because it is powerful.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. So this poem, finding my page, is an interesting poem. It's about George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door in 1963. I was not born at this time. I was born in 1990, so I don't have literal memory of this, but growing up in Alabama.
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Well, you can tell me if I captured it well, Steve.
I know you did, yeah.
Thank you. But growing up in Alabama, you kind of can't not know this. You grow up learning about this history in one way or another. Now, I had parents who made sure we knew all the history and understood what it all meant. So growing up, we weren't Alabama football fans. Most people assume that I am because I'm from Alabama. I don't really like football anyway, which is like blasphemous for a Southerner. But I also am constantly contending with the complicated histories that we have here in so many institutions. So it's hard for me to just say, oh, it's just football, because nothing is just anything, So this poem, it's a lot of setup, is about that moment where he stands in the schoolhouse door. And I wanted to try to sort of see beyond all the pictures and videos I had seen as a kid growing up. I sort of associated George Wallace just immediately with evil. Like, I didn't really understand that he also was a human being. And part of that empathy process is not excusing those people who did bad things, but understanding that they were human beings too. So that means a few things. It means that none of us are far away from crossing a particular line. We can't act as if we're all holier than thou and unable to enact harm on other people. That's why we all have to constantly do self-check-ins and do our work to make sure we're not spreading any sort of harm. It also kind of, I don't know, it sort of changed how I looked at the dichotomy of good versus evil. There's always circumstances surrounding what people do and what people have done in history. And when I think about that sort of viewpoint with the civil rights movement, it helps me to understand that a lot of people, how do I want to say, there was a lot of moving parts that created this system. I can't dissolve it just into George Wallace. There was a lot around him. And he had a more complicated story than I even knew as well. So there's a lot of research that went into this poem. And I'll read the poem instead of just talking about it. But maybe if you have any questions afterward, I'm happy to answer them. It's called Rammer Jammer. And for those who don't know, that's part of, I think it's called the fight song. I'm not a football person, I'm sorry. But the song they sing when they like do something well in the University of Alabama. Rammer Jammer. George Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door, June 11th, 1963. Between the thighs of the doorway, you are powerful. The confetti of camera clicks and your smart business suit and the swamp of teenage protesters swaddle you with sweat. Important men from Washington have come to clear you out. Tension, thick and bitter as a watermelon rind. From the doorway, you see Vivian and James waiting in the government car. They wish to register here. From the doorway, you see walls and waves of ballot-faced whites. They are check marks in the next election. It is only after your speech is delivered that you realize how thirsty you are. Your cotton mouth is unbecoming for a state leader. How nice it would be to sit on your porch with Lurleen and a glass of sweet tea. How nice it would be to get out of this heat and out of Tuscaloosa and back to marbled Montgomery and its halls that echo, obedient, loud, and white. Thank you.
Can I say that when Ashley and I spoke about that, she told me that she does all this research, before writing, which I can relate to, and that one of the things that she had noticed in looking at either film or photos was the way, I believe, that how his suit coat was, sport coat was buttoned or something like that,
Yeah.
and that was kind of your way in to this story.
It was. It really was. So as I said, I was so used to seeing George Wallace as just this purely evil figure. I never really considered his humanity. And so in wanting to write this poem, I knew I had to find that way in, because I can't write the poem if I don't have some human hallway that I can walk down. Because even poems that aren't from my perspective, they are still about me, or, from me. Even if I'm thinking as George Wallace or whatever, it still has to be from me. I have to have some sort of foothold in it. And so looking at those pictures, I did notice that his suit jacket was just kind of askew in some way. And that sort of led me into this whole thought process of, well, okay, either he was in a hurry, either he didn't have anybody around him to say, hey, your jacket's messed up. I call that not having any people, to help you. Or that the only people who were around him were yes men who were just there to kind of, shoo him along and, almost using him as the figurehead, which is, I think, what happened. And that led me to do more research. And I learned that, Wallace didn't originally run as a segregationist. He tried to be governor a few years before he won in 1963. And he only changed his stance publicly. I can't speak for his, inner workings. I don't know what he believed before this, but he changed his platform to segregationist policies because he became backed by the Klan, which of course meant he had more money, but that also meant you had to please the Klan. So you had to do certain things. So it became more complicated for me. And that was sort of how I was able to enter that piece.
And two things, and then Kyla, because I've done all the talking. One, I was very much struck by the humanity, the little, thinking about his wife and the thirst and the iced tea. It was brilliant, very brilliantly done.
Thank you.
And the other thing, just a piece of history. I'm not sure if you remember, Ashley, but it's actually Prince George's County is where he was shot at the campaign. So this is the county, one of our cities in the north part of the county, Laurel, Maryland. He was at the rally. And so, yeah, it just kind of comes full circle. And I love how it's a lesson for all of us. You're right. We do have to find the humanity in each other, and probably more so with people that we immediately have this visceral response that they're evil. And it's hard. It's hard. And, sort of the climate that we're in now makes it harder because it is easy to other somebody and to take that humanity when we do that, even when some of the things are truly, truly evil. So thank you. It's a lesson for me to always remember to try and find that piece of humanity. So
I add one thing that listening to Ashley speak triggered here when she talked about her family and not being strict Bama football fans because of the history there and so forth. It brings me back to the point I was making about being able to, through the stories of the people in the book, come into the worlds that we might not see otherwise, which is what literature and poetry do anyway. And it's great, nonfiction can do that as well, to, take the reader into a world that they're not familiar with. And so I'm thinking of Ebony Lumumba from Jackson, the professor, an English professor at Jackson State and the wife of the mayor of Jackson currently. And she told me that if she broke curfew, her punishment was having to look at a scrapbook of all of the relatives of hers before who were involved in the civil rights movement, so that she would appreciate, her own personal history and be a good citizen in a sense. And so those were just the kind of delicious kind of factoids that I uncovered through these interviews that brought me into a world that I was just not familiar enough with.
Well, there is so much here. And I want to focus on this part about empathy. And I think it's Neil Gaiman. I use this quote and I always miscredit it. So I need to Google it before I use it again. But about novels being little empathy machines. And I think that it's true. We've talked about poetry. And Ashley, I absolutely love your poetry. And it's so, I don't even know, it's so full of heart and also so instructive. And it makes me think of C.T. Salazar, another poet that we've been very fortunate to have a couple times here. And C.T., I remember talking to C.T. about poetry, and he said that he always tries to do no harm. And I was thinking about, it's maybe the same way as you're finding that empathetic connection. And I'm looking over here. I want to read a quote from my screen. It's a bit late, so excuse me for looking away from you. But one of the things that really jumped out to me is the chapter "He's Captain America" about the cartoonist Visajit Singh. And Mr. Singh writes, "One piece of wisdom I have learned over time is what we have in common is our prejudice towards other human beings. It's just how we have evolved. And maybe we can use that as a starting point to have conversations, because we tend to typically say, I don't have prejudices. let's talk about what prejudice we all have, and it starts with genuine connection. And so I love that. And it, as you were speaking, it made me think of that part too. And maybe, I'd love to hear from both of you about how and if those types of conversations are conversations you feel you can have with people in the various worlds in which you intersect.
You want to start, Ashley?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think it is incredibly difficult to have that conversation. Any conversation which requires us to admit our own biases is difficult, but extremely necessary. I find that's sort of where the roadblocks come, especially now. In these times, I hate to use that phrase, but I really feel like that's where we're stuck. If we could all collectively get past this illusion that somehow some of us are not, that we don't have bias of some kind, or even this idea for a while, people were saying we were in a post-racial society because we had President Obama. I don't know what that means to be post-racial, because we will always have race. Like, what's wrong with having race? We look different. We have different cultures. That's another part, understanding that differences are actually great. And I think for too long, our society has tried to pretend that sameness is the same as progress, but that's not true at all. So how I try to have these discussions, whether I'm with students or otherwise, is celebrating my own individual differences. So when I enter a room, I want everyone to know I'm showing up as a Black woman, as a Southern woman, as someone who, loves her father and her mother, someone who loves, listening to Stevie Wonder, whatever. I want to show up as my full self everywhere, on the page and otherwise, so people can feel comfortable showing up as their full self as well. And I try to be very explicit when I say, if I'm reading a poem, for example, I have a poem that's called It's Entirely Possible for a Black Girl to Be Loved, which is very specific in who it's addressing. But I always preface that poem by saying I'm being specific on purpose, because in writing, we know the more specific we get, the more universal that message then becomes. Because once I've said, I am me and I love me, that is me also saying you are you and you can love you too. And if we can start at that point, I find that it's a lot easier for us to then discuss, okay, how has my culture impacted bias, or how have I participated in harm in any way, and how can I then move out of that? Once we divorce ourselves from identifying as good or whatever, you can still be good, and you can still be you, and you can still have bias. These are all things that can happen, but you have to start from a baseline of self-love, self-acceptance, and knowledge that learning is not the same as admitting you're an evil person, or saying I need to grow is not the same as, oh no, now I'm branded forever as this one thing. Even George Wallace, and I even hesitate to say this, attempted, to sort of rebrand himself. And I don't think it was successful necessarily, but I think we all deserve a chance to try, to learn from our mistakes. If it's an earnest attempt, and it's one that's made with humility, and that's maybe where I think he might have failed. But if it's made with humility and the true eagerness to be a part of a diverse and accepting society, maybe we can do that. And I do find that art and books and things that are sort of neutral landing grounds, that is sort of where people can begin a little easier. If it's not the ballot box, it's not which news channel do you watch, it's here we are looking at a painting about X thing. Maybe we're looking at Guernica, by Picasso. How do we both enter this? We can discuss this thing and not necessarily whatever preconceived notions or baggage we've brought in. So.
Thank you.
For me, I would say, well, first of all, in COVID times, it's been more difficult to kind of move out of whatever your comfort zone was. And this has been these last few years when, pundits and thinkers say you should interact more with, with people who might be a little different than you and have different ideas, well, it's difficult enough being with people who have the same ideas and family members and so forth. So that's made things a little difficult just because of that. But I would say that I confess to really, even before that and now, being somewhat in a bubble here, with like-minded people in Evanston, where I am outside Chicago, which is demographically diverse, prides itself on, being this kind of kumbaya type community, which it really isn't, but it tries in some ways. We're the first town in the country to be doing some form of reparations, and which was controversial on many levels. But I think that for me, what Vishavjit said in what you read, Kyla, there's a lot of in my circle, kind of self-congratulation about not being prejudiced. And then there's always, like, just as an example, like, from someone who's self-congratulatory, and then it'll be, like, this Black person was just taking so much time crossing the street in front of me. It was really a screw you moment, and I want to say, like, have you ever had a white person walking slowly across from you? Was that so there's those of us who kind of congratulate ourselves for being colorblind or, being progressive, have a tendency to, be a little blind to our own prejudices. And then it becomes a question of, do you call someone out on that? Do you, if they're your friend, forget about someone from across the aisle, figuratively. Do you call someone out on that? Do you let it pass? And what I think is kind of great about some of the people that I've spoken with for the book is that that has been their moment, and that is when they've decided to act. There's this young man, Brian John, from New Jersey, who as a freshman in high school saw, he's Korean American, heard about a teacher who had, on the first day of school, had said, "Tell me what your background is," to all the students. And when the students who said, "I'm Korean American," this teacher said, "I hate Koreans." And he had as a freshman, had the wherewithal to challenge that. Some of the students in her class who were seniors and who had been targeted by her were afraid that if they spoke up, their college applications and their futures would be in jeopardy. This kid raises, 1,600 signatures on a petition and ousts the teacher, and then forms the Asian American Youth Council to advocate for Asian Americans. So those are people who I really admire, and that's what I think what I was trying to do in the book, in some sense, say, okay, what do you do when that moment presents itself? Do you get off the sidelines or don't you? And besides trying to provide a certain amount of inspiration by telling the stories of all the people in the book, I always ask them at the end of our interviews, what guidance would you give to people, young and older, for when their moment, arises? And, it might be, don't reinvent, don't try and reinvent the wheel. Be patient. The change doesn't happen overnight. Or one of the ones that was consistent was take care of yourself first. If you're not healthy, you can't help other people become healthy. And a Rabbi Jacobs, who I spoke to for the book, said, there is a Sabbath rest, every once in a while. And so you can be energized to fight the good fight.
If I could just add just a tiny little bit onto that, I think something that I learned over the 2020 situation, we all know all the things that happened. I realized that there are many ways to take up that moment. You might look back in time, especially for me as somebody from Birmingham. Of course, I know about all those who marched. A friend of mine was a foot soldier as a child. She was in the Children's March. She went to jail. Like, people were really putting their bodies on the line in these ways. But I realized during that year, because I know myself very well, and I am not really set up, for that kind of physical direct action. I am like anxious, and I would ruin the whole thing, I know, just by being, oh no, what are we doing? There's the police. How are we going to get out of here? Like, I am not who you want on those front lines. But there were people even then who had to do other things. There's so much we can all do. And since I have the ability to write and to organize people around art and try to create pathways for empathy, that's what I did during that year. And that's what I've been doing forever. That is what I want to keep doing. And so I would encourage anybody out there who even reads the book or thinks about getting into activism, understand that activism doesn't look one way. Even Steve writing this book or having this book available, that's an activist thing that he is doing. That's an action that he's doing. So whatever resources you have, even if your only resource is your voice to tell someone, don't say that about X, group of people. Please, don't call the police on this person because you're afraid of their skin color. Whatever you can do, you can do that. It doesn't have to be, none of us can be Dr. King. Dr. King was Dr. King. Like, we don't have to try to achieve that impossible goal, but we each can lift something together, or lift something ourselves, so that everybody's lifting, something together. Just wanted to add that for anybody out there.
And in the way the book is structured is that at the beginning of each chapter, there's a moment or a reflection by the change maker for that chapter. And I remember that's the beginning of Ashley's chapters. Like, I look at the past and wonder if I would have been able to be that brave to march and so forth. But I do realize that there are other things that I can do. And that, again, is, like a common theme of using earlier, a couple days ago, when at the first bookstore reading for this book, I was with a young man who had been he was filling out his college applications pre-DACA, and he asked his mother for his Social Security number, and she said, "You don't have one." And he said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You're undocumented." He didn't know, and he was like he's a senior in high school, and instead of kind of retreating, he started, at the risk of deportation, speaking out on behalf of immigrant rights. And now, so he's gone to medical school now. And so how is he going to be able to, channel his activism or desire to effect change? Just by going into community medicine and advocating, becoming a voice again for people who might not have their own voice.
I love this. I found these stories so inspiring, and I'm glad that we've touched a little bit on the moment, right? Like, you notice that there's a problem or you see something, but and that's one thing. And as we've sort of discovered, not everybody even gets there, but then to see that and then to take the action. And so I could talk about that at length, but I want to get to one question first, which is, how did you find the people in the book? How did there's so many different folks here? Steve, how did you find them all?
Well, I started with the idea that I wanted, you read the beginning about they're as diverse as America and so forth. So I knew I wanted people of varying backgrounds, personal backgrounds, professional backgrounds, ages, and so forth. And I wanted them from the arts, the professions, students, and so forth. And I made a wish list of people, some of whom agreed to be in the book, and some of whom were more difficult to even reach. But I knew I didn't want people that were all famous, and I knew I wanted people that I knew enough about already from just reading about them or reading what they've already done, so that they would be a good interview and a worthy addition to the book. So as I said, reading Ashley's poetry made me, sure, it's great. The first Black poet laureate in Alabama's history, that shouts out at you. But if I read about her, or and her poetry doesn't resonate to me, or her story from what I can read before even talking to her doesn't resonate, I'll look for someone else.
Mhm.
And I also wanted young people, because I think the sweet spot for this book, to inspire people and to create a generation of change makers, is young people. So I wanted a group of young people that I thought readers could relate to. And I wanted people, even though I did, like a supermarket, or a shopping center, you want that anchor tenant that everybody's heard about, So, but you also want other kind of specialty shops in that might draw people. And so I wanted people that you hadn't heard of before, because most of the readers are going to say to themselves, like, I'm not Dr. King, so how can I be something? But when you read about, a high school student in California who, after a nasty video surfaced after George Floyd was murdered, thought, what can I do? And loved the arts, so had her fellow students create art based on what the concept of social justice means, and then worked with local artists to do murals and then talk about that. She's, she puts her pants on just like the rest of us do, and is not Martin Luther King, or at least not yet.
I just, a question just came up that I just put on the screen because it seemed in I think you were hitting on this question. So the question is, please give some examples or stories of small moments and small responses that made a difference.
Sure. There's a chapter in the book about two young people. They're in their early 20s, Ben Shore and Deontay Hanna. And they created eventually an organization in Cherry Hills, New Jersey, called Rise Against Hate. And it was inspired by Ben's experience. Ben's white, Deontay's African-American, Black, and but Ben has an aunt who's married to an African-American man, so he has Black cousins. After George Floyd was murdered, Ben was, and when he heard about it, was so shaken by it that he pulled off. He was driving and he pulled onto the side of the road just to kind of process what had gone on. And he's sitting there in his car, like kind of almost crying, and a police car comes up behind him. Policeman gets out of the car and says, "Can I help you? Are you okay?" And Ben, at that moment, realizes how different that experience would have been for one of his cousins if a police car had pulled up and just seen a black kid on the side of the road and might not have said, "May I help you? You know, what's going on?" And if you said, "Well, I just heard that a policeman killed George," you know, that would have even been worse. But so it's those, that was his moment when he said, "I have to do something." So he talked to his friend Deontay, and they created this organization called Rise Against Hate, which, you know, tries to promote social justice. So those are, you know, those are the kind of moments that I tried to, you know, tease out of people that are in the book.
Thank you. Renee, do you have a question? Well, I know I'm looking at the time, but
Yeah,
Renee, do you
actually,
have a
I
question?
really wanted to ask Ashley first, and then Steve, are there any sort of closing statements or sentiments that you wish to share?
I think I would just say there's nothing too small that anyone can do. I was just thinking about the last question, just personally, if there have been small things that I've observed that mean so much. And I know in my life, it can really be something as simple as, you know, your school librarian having books by people who are of a different race. That's an easy thing to do. I mean, hopefully it remains easy. We know how things are going with education, but just having something available or changing your language, you know, how you refer to certain moments in history, that can mean everything. Or even something as small, honestly, as not crossing a street if you see someone of a different race than you, or not clutching your purse tighter, or, you know, trying to unlearn some of those seemingly involuntary actions. All of that is helpful, and can change the course of somebody's life in some cases, can preserve their life in some cases, or, you know, just make their day better. You know, I would love to have one day in life where I'm not reminded of what the world thinks of me as a Black person. That would be great. So if we could all work together, you know, to make sure we're not contributing to, you know, harming others in any way, that would be awesome. And hopefully reading this book is a great place to start. You don't have to actually talk to anybody physically. You can talk to them through their interviews and then take what you learn throughout your life. So, yeah.
And because the interviews are short, I think they're very easy to dip in and out of. You don't have to read this book from the beginning to the end. You could, you know, in one sitting, you could say, "Oh, I'd like to hear what a poet has to say, or what an architect has to say, or what a pro athlete has to say, or another student." My closing remarks are, I hope that it doesn't seem to be self-serving. Of course, I want everyone to read this book, but I hope that, you know, adults, older people who read the book will give the book or consider gifting a book to a younger person, because that's, I mean, we know just from this last election, you know, our hope is with young people right now. And so this book is, if there's anything I hope from this book, it's that it inspires young people to recognize their moments and act. And towards that end, and I will throw this out to your our audience tonight. Towards that end, I'm making a really concentrated effort to get the book into the hands of young people, and to follow up that by offering myself and some of the change makers from the book who are willing to do so, to zoom into classrooms to talk to young people about how you get off the sidelines, how you recognize your moment, and so forth. And so just our little effort at this time is, because there are 3 change makers from Jackson, Mississippi, and because they've had a tough year, down there. I asked my friends, and my wife and I also got involved in seeding a fund to buy books directly from the publisher to donate to Jackson. And so we're giving 450 books to school children in Jackson, free, obviously, and then working with the public school system down there to Zoom in afterwards to have discussions. And so I would love to do that everywhere, and certainly, be available to audience members here if they have classrooms or schools or organizations to come in and talk about the book.
Stay tuned, Steve.
Yeah. No, this has been great. And I want to put a couple of things on the screen. So first of all, about that, if you are listening, I'm going to put my personal email in the chat. And if you would like to reach out, I have put Steve's website in the chat as well. And I'll also put it up here again to learn about the book and buy the book. And in just a moment, you'll see my email up here where you can reach out to me as well if you want to make contact. Learn about the book, talk to Steve, and maybe make some of those arrangements. I will say this, that one of the absolute best ways that you can support writers is by buying their books. And so with us tonight, we have two completely phenomenal writers. I have to say, if you have not read Reparations Now, you must get thee to your nearest bookstore or library. It will blow your mind. It's such an amazing work. And so you can get Ashley's, just 3 collections, and Reparations Now being the most recent one. And then this book, The Moment, which has just come out today as its release date. So it's such an incredible honor that you both would be with us. And so please get this, read it. And as Steve has said, share it, because I think what I found, I'm not young, and I was so inspired, and I have so many questions, and a lot of them was about that moment of action. And so one of the things that I think is so beautiful about this book is it helps us who are, those of us who live, small lives, see the ways in which we are ourselves empowered to just take that step. So it's just phenomenal. So I could go on. I'm going to stop. For those of you watching, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us this evening. We really appreciate it. We have a lot more wonderful things coming up. You can go to pgcmls.info/events to see what the library has coming. And our office, you can see at civilrights.mypgc.us. But we'll put one thing on your radar screen, which is an in-person event that's going to be hybrid virtual with Rabia Chaudhry about her book, Fatty Fatty Boom Boom. And we'll be having her at the Greenbelt Branch Library at 6 p.m. on December 6th. So please come and join us with Rabia. And then Steve and Ashley, I just can't thank you enough for being with us again. Both of you, this is your second time with us. That your generosity to the people of Prince George's County, to the Office of Human Rights, and to the library system has been profound. And we really, really thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being in the book, Ashley.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for asking me.
All right. So thank you and good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.